Hello and welcome back to my channel. I am Dr. Shahin and today I will teach you the pre-romantic movement. This movement is very important in the history of English literature. The pre-romantic movement is a movement in English literature that is a precursor to romanticism. The pre-romantic movement is a precursor to romanticism. The pre-romantic movement is a cultural shift. The pre-romantic movement is a cultural shift that emerged in the mid 18th century and continued to late 18th century. This period marks the beginning of the movement from one distinct school or convention of English poetry towards another. It was a time of moving away from the neoclassical emphasis on reason and order and shifting to a greater emphasis on emotion, feelings, taste, nature, imagination, and individual expression. So, we can say that pre-romanticism was a crucial period in the transition from neoclassicism to romanticism, which paved the way for romantic movement in the early 19th century. अगर आप सिंपल भाषा में समझना चाहते हैं प्री रोमांटिक मूवमेंट को, तो प्री रोमांटिक मूवमेंट एक ऐसी मूवमेंट है, एक ऐसा शिफ्ट है, एक ऐसा ट्रांजिशनल फेज है जो कि स्टार्ट हुआ मिड 18th सेंचुरी में और यह कंटिन्यू हुआ लेट 18th सेंचुरी तक. बहुत सारे स्टूडेंट्स को कंफ्यूजन होती है न्यू क्लासिकल राइटर्स को और द प्री रोमांटिक राइटर्स है उन दोनों को समझने में, और कुछ प्री रोमांटिक और रोमांटिक राइटर्स में कंफ्यूज हो जाते हैं. तो आपको कंफ्यूज होने की ज़रूरत नहीं है, मैं अभी क्लियर करती हूँ. ये जो प्री रोमांटिक राइटर्स जो है एक्चुअली ये आते तो न्यू क्लासिकल पीरियड में ही आते हैं, लेकिन ये स्टार्ट कब किया इन्होंने लिखना स्टार्ट किया मिड 18th सेंचुरी में, और इन्होंने कब तक लिखा लेट 18th सेंचुरी तक. मतलब वहाँ तक इन्होंने लिखा, उस पीरियड तक लिखा जहाँ रोमांटिसिज्म का जो पीरियड है स्टार्ट होता है, यानी 1798 जो पीरियड है वह रोमांटिसिज्म पीरियड स्टार्ट होता है, वहाँ प्री रोमांटिक मूवमेंट का पीरियड ख़त्म होता है. आपको ये ऐसे समझने की ज़रूरत है. और दूसरा इनका फीचर ये है कि जो प्री रोमांटिक्स जो थे यानी और जो अदर नियो क्लासिकल राइटर्स जो पोएट्स जो थे एक्चुअली वो क्या एम्फेसाइज करते थे, वह रीजन ऑर्डर राइट और सिटी लाइफ पे लिखते थे, जैसे अलेक्जेंडर पोप है और डॉक्टर जॉनसन है नियो क्लासिकल पोएट्स राइटर्स. लेकिन ये जो प्री रोमांटिक राइटर्स एक्चुअली ये क्या ये शिफ्ट किया एक तरह से, ये दे टर्न्ड अवे फ्रॉम द थीम्स एंड टेक्निक्स ऑफ द न्यू क्लासिकल पोएट्री एंड मूव टू क्या किस तरफ मूव किया, यह रोमांटिक ट्रैक्ट्स की तरफ मूव किया. रोमांटिक ट्रैक्ट्स जो भी होते हैं जैसे इमोशन, फीलिंग, टेस्ट, नेचर, इमेजिनेशन एंड इंडिविजुअल एक्सप्रेशन, तो इन सब चीज़ों को जो प्री रोमांटिक राइटर्स इम्फेसाइज किए, जो कि एक टर्न था, एक शिफ्ट था न्यू क्लासिकल पोइट्री से हटकर, और ये प्रीकर्सर हो गए. क्यों? प्री रोमांटिक राइटर्स जो हैं दे बिकेम प्रीकर्सर्स टू द रोमांटिक राइटर्स. यानी कि प्री रोमांटिक्स है ये काफ़ी मेजर रोल प्ले किया रोमांटिक राइटर्स जो कि वर्ड्सवर्थ, कॉलरिज, किड्स, बायरन, शेली, इनको इन्फ्लुएंस किया. राइट. So we can say that the pre-romantic writers paved the way for the romantic writers. Right. Now I talk about the pre-romantic writers. Who are the pre-romantic writers? The pre-romantic writers include Thomas Gray, James Thomson, William Collins, William Blake, William Cowper, Robert Burns, Oliver Goldsmith, and George Crabbe. These are the pre-romantic writers. The major intellectual precursor of romanticism was the French philosopher and writer Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who emphasized the free expression of emotion. Thomas Gray is the central figure in this movement. Thomas Gray is the central figure in this movement of pre-romantic movement, and Thomas Gray moves away from the school of classicism. Thomas Gray moves away from the school of neoclassicism towards the rising school of romanticism. His famous Elegy written in a country churchyard, proves to be a transition from the neoclassicism to the romanticism. where he explored the theme of mortality and the simple lives of country folklore. Here he talks about the death of the innocent villagers who died without recognition, without name and fame. And this is the trait of romantic writers, which Thomas Gray reflected in this essay. Now I talk about characteristics of pre-romantic poetry. And the first is emphasize on feelings and emotions. The pre-romantic writers had a greater emphasis on feelings and emotions, which was a contrast to the rational approach of new classicism. We find the notes of feelings and emotions mainly in the poetry of William Collins and Robert Burns. As Robert Burns writes in his poem, the title is A Red, Red Rose, where he says, "Oh, my love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. Oh, my love is like the melody." Here, these lines evokes the sense of feeling and emotion. It is imbued with sense of emotion and feeling. Next, I talk about love for nature. The pre-romantic poets took nature as a theme for their poetry. James Thomson's poem, The Season, is an important landmark in the history of English poetry at that time. The Season is the first poem in which nature became the central theme at that time. George Crabbe, the next pre-romantic poet, who in his poem The Village describes the miseries of the poor villagers, showing his concern for the humble humanity who live in the lap of nature. Nature is also an important theme in so many poems of William Blake. William Blake, you know, he is a pre-romantic writer. He loves nature. William Blake loves nature, but all nature for him is a window to God. Also, all the poems of Robert Burns reflect the spirit of romanticism and the love for nature. William Cowper's poems also reflect the spirit of love for nature, and his famous slogan, "God made the country and man made the town," reflects his love for nature. Clear? Next is mysticism and imagination. We find the note of mysticism and imagination in the poetry of pre-romantic writers. William Blake was the first to introduce the romantic note of mysticism in English poetry. This is a very important point. Keep in the mind that William Blake was the first poet to introduce the romantic note of mysticism in English poetry. Although William Blake is a transitional poet or a precursor of the romantic revival in many ways, he is even more romantic than romantic poets. William Blake, you know, he is a transitional poet. He is a precursor of the romantic revival, and he is even more romantic than the romantic poets. That's why William Blake is called the first romantic poet. William Blake is called the first romantic poet because of his romantic traits in his poetry, although he belongs to pre-romantic period. About imagination, William Blake says, "One power alone makes a poet, one power alone makes a poet, imagination, the divine vision." William Blake regards imagination as a divine vision. Imagination is the only power which makes someone a great poet. That's why he appreciated the power of imagination. Next is supernatural and Gothic. Pre-romantic writers explored the supernatural, the mysterious, and macabre elements. This is also a very important feature of pre-romantic poetry, that pre-romantic writers explored the supernatural, the mysterious, and macabre elements. It gave rise to a growing interest in the unknown and a departure from the rationalist approach of the Enlightenment. It was a departure from the rationalist approach of the Enlightenment from the rational approach of the neoclassical era. Next is past and folk traditions. The pre-romantic writers took interest in the past. The pre-romantic writers took interest in the past, particularly the medieval period and folk traditions. The pre-romantic writers took more interest in the medieval period and folk traditions. Therefore, most of them focus on local dialects. Most of the pre-romantic writers focus on local dialects and cultural practices. As we see, Robert Burns, who is a pre-romantic writer and poet, and he used his local dialect, that is Scots dialect, in his poetry. Clear? And the last is individual and rebellion against tradition. The pre-romantic writers also emphasized the importance of individual. The pre-romantic writers emphasized the importance of the individual and their unique perspective. They rebelled against the strict rules and conventions of the Enlightenment. The pre-romantic writers actually they truly rebelled against the strict rules and conventions of the new classicism, and they moved towards more personal. These pre-romantic writers, they moved towards more personal and less formal artistic styles. Clear? So these are the characteristics of pre-romantic poetry. Thank you.